It was a big place and, one had to admit, an impressive one. For some inexplicable reason, the modern exterior hid an interior done in the style of an old baronial castle, like those lavish sets you sometimes see in movies. Basically, it's a Victorian interpretation of the perfect medieval castle. In fact, in the good old days, they didn't have the technology to build such large and extravagant buildings. One thing I knew for sure was that the wedding would not have taken place in such a venue if I was paying the bill. But my ex-wife Shauna had made sure that didn't happen years before. I thought I had found a safe hiding place, tucked away in the pseudo-minstrel's gallery, which served as both a spotlight tower and a projection room, from which I could watch the ceremony but not be seen by anyone on the floor of the main hall below. I was well aware that my presence, if made known, would prove controversial to say the least, and would probably lead to an unpleasant confrontation between me and my former in-laws. Besides, I was sure my daughter would be less than thrilled if it happened. I even assumed that Tamsin would be even less pleased to learn of my presence than Witch and George, her crony husband. Anyway, I was sitting in silence, lurking at the back of the minstrel's gallery, from where I could watch the wedding of my estranged daughter, when suddenly a voice whispered right into my ear. "Hey, handsome! I thought you wouldn't miss this little celebration." To say that the sound of that voice made me wince is an understatement. I literally jumped off the fishing stool I was sitting on and collapsed to the floor. Well, yes. If I had been sitting on that little stool and watching the service through the bars of the balustrade, I would have thought there was less chance of anyone noticing me. The rumble that the small aluminum stool made as it fell to the stone floor of the minstrel's gallery and then drove across it had to be seen to be believed. I realized that any chance of my presence remaining secret had instantly evaporated. From my new position, lying on my back on the floor, I looked up and saw trouble towering over me. My daughter's aunt, looking very embarrassed, was making frantic, apologetic hand gestures toward the hall below. Megan, or Trouble, as I jokingly nicknamed her in my younger days, was, or rather already was, my ex-wife's mischievous younger sister. Megan was often the bane of our courtship. As I glanced between the bars of the balustrade, I realized that my hiding place had suddenly become the center of attention for almost everyone in the building. The bride, groom, celebrant, photographer, choir, cameraman, and most of the congregation were all looking at Megan with an annoyed and/or somewhat puzzled expression. So I pressed myself as hard as I could against the floor and prayed that no one else would notice me. Then Megan, signaling that the service was in progress, picked up my little stool and delicately lowered her cute little belly onto it. From my reclining position, I could no longer see the floor of the main hall, but I could almost hear what was going on downstairs, and soon realized that the wedding service had resumed. I hoped that the incident had been written off as one of Megan's tricks. Megan's penchant for unusual behaviors and surprises was legendary in the family, even when she was a child. "It's okay, you can watch now," Megan whispered. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you jump, Billy." "Make me jump, woman." "You damn near gave me a heart attack!" "Where did you learn to sneak around like that, Megan?" I whispered, maneuvering myself into a position from which I could observe what was happening below. It became clear to me that I had temporarily lost the use of my little stool. "Oh, I kind of picked that up as a kid, sneaking up on a couple of familiar lovers." She lowered her gaze and winked at me. "You cheeky little monkey." "I'm not so little anymore, Billy boy. Just watch your step, or you might find yourself raped later." "Oh no, I won't, Megan. I'm on train number 430 leaving this bleeding hellhole." Megan looked down at me again, made a strange but oddly familiar gesture with her eyes that I thought meant, "That's what you think," and then made a hand gesture toward the set below. By doing so, she let me know that the conversation was cut off until the ceremony was over. "I always liked Shauna's little sister. Yeah, sometimes she was a real pain in the ass when Shauna and I were courting. But Shauna was always less tolerant of Trouble's antics than I was. Megan always struck me as a good-hearted kid who needed attention. There was a good 4 years between the two sisters, a recipe for discord like never before. I always thought Megan just didn't realize that her older sister, and me included, needed a little privacy from time to time. The service was over, and I tried my best to get a good look at the groom as he led Tamsin out of the hall. Not that the angle made it an easy task if I was going to stay out of sight. As far as I could judge the guy, he seemed like a decent enough person. Thankfully, Everyone was so focused on the bride and groom that I don't think anyone even looked at the minstrel gallery. But as soon as the motorcade was out of sight below us, Megan started trying to drag me to my feet. "Come on, Billy, we'd better get down to the dining room." I resisted Megan's fierce tugging on my arm, trying to stay out of sight until all the guests had left the room. There's no way in hell Megan's showing up at this party. "Oh my God, I'm going to jail." "Don't talk nonsense, Billy. It's your own daughter's wedding." "Why would the police arrest you?" "Well, there's that bleeding restraining order for starters," muttered I. "No, Billy, Shauna is already dead, and she's the only person listed on the restraining order. When he killed her, the order immediately became null and void." "What do you mean he killed her?" demanded I, almost jumping to my feet. "It was an accident, wasn't it?" "Billy, that bloody moron has always driven like a bloody idiot. And he still does. That weirdo has been... There's a disaster waiting to happen every time he gets behind the damn wheel. Do you have any idea how fast he was going that day?" "I know very little about it, Megan." "I saw skid marks on the road, Billy. He drove like a bloodthirsty idiot that night, just like he always does. I just can't understand how he hasn't been prosecuted for my sister's murder. Even Tamsin knows who's responsible for her mother's death. You may have noticed he wasn't there tonight. He wasn't invited." "Me too, Megan." "Yes, you were, in a way. I just couldn't find you to let you know. Look, my invitation says, Miss Megan Stone and a guest. No reservations or anything. Guess who's going to be my guest?" I laughed out loud. "You've got to be kidding me, Megan. Me showing up at Stone's wedding? Been there once, remember, my girl. And you remember how that turned out in the end. The fact that my sister was a stupid cow has nothing to do with it, Billy. You're Tamsin's father and... Christ, you were supposed to be there today, giving her away in marriage, not her grandfather. Now you and I are going to the reception together, and I don't want to hear any nonsense about restraining orders. My Uncle Albert assures me that there is no legitimate reason why you should not attend the reception as my guest. What's more, he thinks it's a damn good idea. He's always been in your camp, you know, even when things went wrong. And here I was wondering why that old bastard doesn't represent Shauna," commented I. "Look, Billy, if my Uncle Albert thought he could get away with it, I'm damn sure he'd represent you for free. He was totally unimpressed with my sister's behavior back in the day and took a real hard line on her and my mom and dad. He outright refused to represent Shauna. As far as I know, he and my mother haven't spoken 2 polite words to each other since. The only time I ever saw them in the same room together was at Shauna's funeral. I think Uncle Albert was a little disappointed that you didn't show up that day. I wasn't even in Megan's country. I was helping a team filming the fauna and flora on South Georgia. Ever since those people got trapped there when the Argentines invaded, well, they prefer us to stay off the ship if possible. Anyway, I didn't know anything about Shona's accident until 3 months after her funeral when we returned to the UK. I met Toby. What's his name in Falmouth, and he told me about the accident. While I listened to the explanation, Megan lifted me to my feet and started dusting off my whistle. "No!" "That's my costume. God, some people's minds, I ask you." "Come on, Billy," Megan continued. "Let's go down to the front desk before the line for the reception dissipates." The way Megan gripped my hand tightly, I realized that, whether I liked the idea or not, Megan had decided that I would attend my daughter's wedding reception. Against my better judgment, I apparently admitted defeat. I had to admit that it was probably only because of the considerable amount of alcohol I'd consumed in the previous 24 hours. It clouded my judgment enough that I was able to give in to Megan's desires. Yeah, look, I'd better explain. When Shauna and I first, broke up, I have to admit that I didn't handle the situation as well as I could have. I ended up spending more than a few days visiting American authorities, or local law enforcement anyway, when I took it upon myself to exact a little retribution. I gave the new man in Shauna's life a little reprimand. It might have been a frivolous and somewhat enjoyable endeavor, but in the long run it was going to turn out to be very misguided. The confrontation didn't end the way I expected, and as a result, I got a thorough kick in the ass. Unfortunately, Shauna somehow got caught up in the mess, leading to her visit to a nearby emergency room, as the Yanks like to put it. Hence my incarceration, and the numerous court orders issued in both the US and the UK forbidding me from coming within a mile or so of Shauna's whereabouts, permanently or almost permanently. Anyway, I can assure the reader that I personally have never laid a finger on my unfaithful wife. Well, to the best of my knowledge, not once. This statement will probably become clearer to you later, I'm sure. Where was I? Oh yeah! Anyway, after the court had had its way, I was an ex-convict, as the Yanks like to call us, and was labeled a bully and a wife-beater. And after the fight, I was unceremoniously stripped of my parental rights to our daughter Tamsin. Almost all of this happened while I was still in an American prison, by the way. Not a pleasant experience, I assure you. However, at that time in my life, nothing was fun at all. The label of an ex-convict did not help my work career much either. Try to get a work visa to the United States with such a record. None of this, however, stopped Shauna, with the assistance of the British legal system, from demanding that I provide financial support for Tamsin until the child turned 18. I'm not very proud of what I have to admit. After the system kicked my ass so effectively, I took solace in drinking for a while. However, I managed not to turn into a complete wreck or a hardened alcoholic. But that was probably due to inherited biological traits rather than any kind of mental impulse, if you know what I mean. However, I still needed something to help me face the day in the best possible way. "Are you still working in the movie industry, Billy?" asked Megan, leading a somewhat unsure me, so we slowly made our way forward, up the stairs to the main lobby of the establishment. "No, not really, Megan," I replied. "I guess you could say I'm in the shipping business now. Most of the time I work as a sailor on research vessels and the like, though I do shoot quite a bit. I suppose it's handy for them to have a backup or second experienced cameraman on the crew to help document what's going on. Sometimes I'm the only cameraman on board." "So you've given up on Hollywood?" "Megan, I've never worked for any of the big guys. The most I've ever been able to do was as a second-string cameraman. And on some pretty mediocre third-rate movies at that. Unfortunately for me, my wife was much more successful with directors and producers than my work." "Shauna always wanted to be a star, Billy. You knew that before you even married her." "Yeah, but I had no idea how far she'd go to realize her dream." "Hell, look at this pile!" We found ourselves in the lobby of the hotel, through which we had to pass to reach the entrance to the function room in which the Tamsin's wedding reception. The huge space was filled with guests patiently waiting in line for the official reception line. I figured the witch, Megan and Shauna's mother, planned the show and she put her best foot forward. The witch has an even bigger megalomania than my ex-wife had. The witch planned and organized our weddings, even though they weren't on the same scale as this celebration. I should add that the witch and I have never been members of each other's respective fan clubs. So I assumed that my appearance at this reception might go disastrously awry. Finding myself anonymously in the crowd no longer made me feel so vulnerable. Though more than one of our guests' relatives quickly interjected, recognizing me, probably from Shauna's wedding and my own years before. I also knew I had a few allies out there somewhere, but they would be kept a closely guarded secret. The Stones were a pretty tight-knit clan. Eventually, the crowd began to thin, and the witch finally spotted me from her seat a little farther back from the receiving line. Her face instantly turned crimson, and for a moment I thought I saw smoke coming out of her ears. Although I protested, Megan dragged me through the entrance to the conference room and to the front of the reception line. Tamsin's new husband was momentarily stunned when Megan introduced him to her fiancé's father. The poor man didn't know what to do or say. I shook a very weak hand. Tamsin was just as shocked, if not more so. As I stared into her eyes, they grew larger and larger, and I feared they were about to pop out of her skull. You know, I really think the kid had no idea who I was until he heard Aunt Megan inform her new spouse that I was Tamsin's father. For some inexplicable reason, I decided to say, "Hey, baby, it's been a while since I've ridden you on my lap," before I took her outstretched hand and kissed the back of it. Yeah, I thought about hugging Tamsin, but I was afraid she might faint if I did. Tamsin's response boiled down to, but, until Megan nudged me with her elbow. The next face that caught my eye was Witch's buddy George. He recognized me and handled the situation quite well. "Well, I thought so." "William, we weren't, well, this is an unexpected surprise. How did you—" "Billy is my guest dad. If he goes, I go. commanded Megan, sitting down next to me. I wondered if Megan had talked to Tamsin. It seemed to me that there just wasn't time. I wouldn't assume that for a second, Megan. The old lady replied, Of course William is welcome here. I was just surprised he was in the country. Your mother assured me he was working somewhere on the Antipodes right now? I worked in Antarctica, sir. I have no idea why I addressed the bastard as sir. Probably habit. My ship docked in New Zealand 5 weeks ago, I informed the old man. You see, Megan, your mother has been trying to contact William. You got her message, I assume, William. Your mother told you she would contact William, Megan? You are very welcome here today, my boy. George shifted his attention from me to Megan as he spoke. Whatever he said, I was sure there was no message. In the age of modern electronic communication, things are pretty good out there. Only occasionally interrupted by extremely bad weather on coastal base. So despite all the old man's assurances to the contrary, I was certain that I had never been included on the guest list, even tentatively. The fact that my ex-mother-in-law had disappeared from the waiting list by the time we got to her house convinced me of that. I even wondered if she'd rushed off to call the police or something. Tamsin's new relatives were polite and pleasant and obviously very confused. They didn't look like they'd seen a ghost. Better to say they were shocked to find themselves shaking hands with one of them. It was all pretty funny from my point of view, but it made me wonder what exactly they had been told about Tamsin's father. Most of the other guests had no idea who I was, so we were looked at rather curiously, probably to see why Megan had decided to watch the wedding ceremony from the minstrel gallery as we left the reception hall. Like everyone else, I took a glass of bubbly from a passing waitress and drank it in one gulp. Megan explicitly told me to slow down as I picked up the second glass. Then the imposing figure of Sir Albert Stone appeared through the crowd. I even wondered why Uncle Albert had not been included among the guests, for he was the patriarch of the whole damn clan. William, my boy. How nice to see you here today. Hyacinth, the witch, made me believe you were abroad and unable to attend, said Albert, holding out his hand for me to shake. I can't say I've always liked the old git. Megan's Uncle Albert is a barrister by vocation, and he always seemed too formal for my liking. In my youth, I had a natural aversion to his type. An aversion which has since been somewhat strengthened by my encounters with members of the legal profession. However, Megan hinted that this old geezer had sided with me during the collapse of my marriage. As a result, I was forced to do a quick reassessment of my feelings for this character. How do you do, sir? I replied, shaking his hand. It's nice to meet you again. Capital, capital. Albert grinned back. I'm not quite sure what the phrase capital, capital, capital is supposed to mean or imply. But I know from memory that it was Uncle Albert's usual response to almost anything and everything that was ever said to him. Provided everything went the way the old bone setter would have liked, that is. At this point, Tamsin appeared in front of me. Her duties on the receiving line had obviously been completed. In fact, completely oblivious to her manners, Tamsin rather rudely elbowed her way between Uncle Albert and me. The expression on Tamsin's face I can only describe as one of sheer disgust. You don't have everyone at home here! What do you want to get some handout or something? Or do you just want to embarrass me? Demanded Tamsin, though surprisingly quiet. I suppose I should point out that Tamsin's words, and the way she said them, were taken straight from the witch's repertoire. It wasn't my daughter speaking to me. It was Tamsin who had been brainwashed by the witch since she was born. The realization of that fact disappointed me, but I didn't take offense at Tamsin's attitude toward me. It only reassured me that everything was as I had suspected. I shifted my gaze from my daughter to Albert, and then to Megan standing next to me. I told you this was a bad idea, Megan. I better leave, I said and turned to leave. No, wait a minute, young man, exclaimed Albert. Loud enough to get the attention of almost everyone standing nearby, and imperious enough to make me stop instantly. I turned around, wondering what the old man would say. Tamsin, your father traveled almost halfway around the world to be here with you on this special day for you. The least you can do is be civil to him. Actually, Albert's statement is not true. I almost always spent the summer months in the UK. Most of my ship and natural history work has taken place in Antarctic waters, but there is not much going on there at this time of year. My daughter looked, well, I'm not sure. Puzzled, I guess you'd call it. She shifted her gaze from me to my uncle to everyone watching, and then back to me again. Then she said, "I'm sorry, Father. Your unexpected presence took me by surprise. You have never shown any interest in my life." "And where did you get that idea from, Tamsin?" Albert roared. "I must tell you, young lady, that your father has watched your development very closely. He has risked arrest on more than one occasion to witness the important events in your life. Isn't that right, young man?" "I'm sorry, sir," I started to reply, but Albert, unprompted, continued talking. "Prize giving at that bloody, stupid, expensive school your mother insisted on sending you to. I am reliably informed that your father attended every one of them. He was also at your graduation from university. Damn it, girl, you walked past your father to get your diploma without even noticing him. He knew who you were, but you didn't recognize him. Don't forget your mother did too, and that may have saved your father from a visit to the local magistrate's court." "I didn't know you were there, Uncle Albert." Tasnim took a chance. "I wasn't, Tamsin?" "At any rate, not as regularly as I would have liked. Your mother and I have had our differences, you know that. But I have people who have been wary of your development all these years, and they might have recognized your father. And none of them could have accidentally broken your father's cover, could they? When your mother was around, your father's presence was technically illegal. I would advise you, Tamsin, to smile sweetly and forget about your supposed disagreement with your father. I assure you he, or rather, your father's reputation in your eyes, has always been a victim of circumstance, coupled with your late mother's extremely poor judgment. Let's have a family truce on this special day, shall we?" By this time, my daughter was looking pretty sheepish. "If you insist, Uncle," Tamsin agreed, then added, "But I wonder what his motivation is for coming here today." Then Tamsin turned her back to me and disappeared into the crowd. After watching her leave, Albert turned to me. "William, I'm afraid your daughter has only heard a one-sided account of her parents' divorce. It didn't help that you and Hyacintha didn't hit it off from the start." "I was never good enough for Shauna in her mother's eyes, sir," replied I. "No one could be good enough for Hyacinth, William. I don't think even my brother fits that description in my sister-in-law's eyes." From the looks of it, however, Hyacintha may have thrown in the towel. She's up there on the platform, apparently rearranging the seats at the top table. When I looked, it turned out that the witch, assisted by her ever-awkward husband George, was indeed rearranging the serving pieces. As we watched, I saw one of the photographers approach them. The witch spoke to him briefly, and then, Hyacinth was obviously pleased with her rearrangements, the small entourage left the platform. "They're getting ready for a group picture, Billy. We'd better go," informed Megan quietly to me. "No, you go ahead, Megan. Tamsin won't be thrilled with my presence. Besides, I'll look completely out of place in the pictures without the monkey outfit. It'll ruin the whole set." "Billy." "Don't argue, Megan. I'm on the verge of leaving anyway. I knew it was a bad idea." After a few more protests from not only Megan but also her Uncle Albert, they left me alone and went outside for a photo shoot. To my relief, almost all the other guests also went out into the hotel garden to watch or participate. I took this opportunity to slip onto the platform and do a little shuffling. Sure enough, the witch sat me down next to Tamsin's new husband. But given my daughter's behavior and the fact that I'd never met this young man before, I thought it might lead to trouble. And besides Megan, Uncle Albert and his wife, apparently my only open allies, were at the end of the table. So I put Grandpa Tamsin in that seat, as I suspected that's where he had originally planned to sit. Then I stuck my own, hastily scribbled, card next to Megan at the end of the table. I figured it would be safer that way. Upon returning from the photo shoot, Megan briefly slipped into spoiled child mode. It had been a while since I'd seen her act like that, and I found it oddly amusing. I figured it was my refusal to participate in the photo shoot that prompted her to do it. "Well, if you keep acting like this, I'm going to go find a bar." It was all I had time to say to put an end to Megan's feigned protest. "Just try to dare and I'll," replied Megan. "And what are you going to do, Megan?" I asked. "I'm not sure. Maybe kiss you. I've always wanted to do that, but I've never had the courage." I always knew Shauna's little sister held a candle for me, but was surprised to hear from Megan that she was still carrying that torch. "Oh my God, Megan. I thought you'd long since grown out of silly teenage crushes." "Oh yeah. I even found what I thought was the man of my dreams. But I soon discovered that all that glitters is not gold, and what you see isn't always what you get. It wasn't until I divorced the creep that I realized exactly what my sister had so flippantly discarded. I'm not at all sure I understand what you meant by that, Megan. Okay, a confused person is safe, she grinned. Come on, looks like they're sitting down to eat. The top table was inordinately long, and Megan and her guest were originally seated somewhat lower in rank. Although the witch had rearranged things, I had, much to the old bitch's dismay, reversed her changes. Great fun, it seemed to me. The witch seemed to accept my rearrangement without protest, but cast a baleful glare at me. Albert sat next to Megan. I thought Hyacinth, he started to comment as we took our seats. I thought her original plan would prove more diplomatic, sir. I interrupted him. With a capital letter, I always knew Hyacinth was wrong about you, my boy. Anyway, drop the formalities, please. To the family, I am Bertie. Throughout most of the meal, Albert monopolized me in conversation. Virtually oblivious to everyone else sitting around him, including his wife, but with the exception of Megan, who sat between us, he spent almost the entire meal asking me pointed questions about my travels. I almost felt like I was in a witness box. Well, he was a top-class barrister, used to cross-examination. Well, let's see how they handle it, shall we? Commented Albert, leaning back in his chair as the master of ceremonies called for silence for the formal toasts. Grandpa Tamsin, who gave it to her, and I assume paid for the party, stood up and gave a brief welcome speech. And then the old git caught me off guard by calling the father of the bride to say a few words and proposing a toast to the happy couple. Judging from the looks on the witch and Tamsin's faces, his proposal was not part of the master plan and was not approved. And it certainly didn't meet with everyone's approval. As I said, the old fool caught me completely confused and totally unprepared. So I had to quickly gather my strength and act with my wings. I really can't remember almost anything I said that day. I think I started by mumbling about unfortunate circumstances or something like that. But then I started talking about Tamsin, inserting just about every humorous incident from her life that I knew of into the speech. Anyway, the speech must have been pretty good, and I suppose prepared in advance, because I was shocked to find the whole damn room erupting into fits of laughter. Perhaps it was because I was making such a fool of myself that they were laughing at me. But even the witch's face cracked at some point in my musings. Then, remembering that I was breaking the magic 7-minute rule, yes, I kept my eyes on the clock, never has the minute hand moved so slowly. I proposed a toast to my new son-in-law and his beautiful bride, and then threw the ball into the groom's court. That was great, Billy. How long did you prepare that speech? Asked Megan as I collapsed into my seat. Did it sound okay? I asked, not believing I had managed to do that. Capital, capital, my boy, repeated Albert. With that kind of turnover, you could make a fortune in after-dinner speeches. Looking at the burly Albert, I realized he knew what he was talking about when it came to after-dinner conversations, and I breathed a sigh of relief. I don't know exactly what happened afterwards, but I do know that there seemed to be an endless circle of people jumping to their feet and reciting surprisingly long and often unintelligent dissertations. There were also toasts to all the Toms, Dicks, and Harrys you can think of, including the Queen. I'm not quite sure how she fit into the equation. Perhaps someone was trying to complete a seemingly endless cycle of mundane speeches. I noted that none of the speakers could match my own performance. Come along, my boy. I have a little corner I have picked out and reserved, said Albert, as people finally began to leave the dining room. It was at this point that I began to suspect that Megan and her uncle Albert had somehow pre-planned my day. Perhaps it was only a rough sketch, but they both clearly knew what they were doing and seemed to be working in unison. Uncle Albert's wife never said much to me, but smiled pleasantly whenever our eyes met. Megan, taking my right hand firmly in hers again, led me into the next room and sat me at a table near the bar. Oddly, for a wedding reception. This table was in a separate little sectioned-off area, the sort of executive areas you sometimes find in high-end nightclubs. I'd always considered such things pretentious and felt out of place sitting there. A young woman who appeared to have been assigned as Albert's personal waitress quickly appeared and took our drink orders. I noticed that almost everyone else had to stand in line at the bar to get a soft drinks. Few of them managed to catch the young woman's eye as they tried to order from her. I also noticed that there was a similar enclosure at the far end of the room, but it had remained empty for the time being. Later, I noticed that the witch, her husband, and the groom's parents periodically retreated there. Shortly after we were served our first round of drinks, Sir Albert Stone began to hold court. Numerous younger members of the Stone clan, some of whom I met at my own wedding many years ago, would arrive, introduce their, mostly adorable but sometimes hideous, offspring to Uncle Albert. Then, after carefully raising their hats to the patriarch of the family, they would disappear back into the crowd. The meaningless pantomime bored me silly and lasted probably about an hour. During the whole time, Albert did nothing but repeat his favorite phrase, "Capital! Capital!" Sometimes he even added a third capital to make it more convincing. Honestly, if this whole thing weren't so ridiculous, it might be funny. I tried to ignore the pantomime and probably would have backed off if Megan hadn't clutched at my arm as hard as she could. And unfortunately, Albert decided to make sure that all of our visitors were reminded, and in some cases informed, that I was Tamsin's biological father. I believe that Albert wanted to let those who thought otherwise know that he had decided to revoke my former status as a family pariah. Whenever I tried to ignore what was going on nearby while chatting with Megan, Albert would introduce another family member, whether they were familiar to me or not. There was one brief interlude of sycophancy while her new husband spun Tamsin around the dance floor. No, I wasn't asked to dance with anyone during that time. Which in a way was very convenient, because I'm not much for the old formalities, especially when my partner and I are the center of attention. "I suppose that's the last of them," said Albert, with relief in his voice as the last little family group withdrew from our enclave. "Now, my boy, I really think we'd better get down to serious business. We can't have your daughter addressing her father the way she did before." Damn impertinent of the kid. It would have been nice if you'd been around to get her on her knees and give her a good spanking years ago. She sure needed it. Heck, her mother needed it too. George was always too soft on Shauna, and then there's young Megan. "Oh, hello, Uncle Albert," grumbled Megan. "Oh, you weren't so bad, Megan. But you have to admit you were a sassy little kid sometimes. Sometimes you gave your parents a real dance and song." "I've never been as bad as Shauna, Uncle." "No, I'll agree with you, Megan. But I'm sure if William had put Shauna on his lap and tanned her back the first time she got over herself, everyone's life would have been a lot easier, including his own." "Knowing Shauna, I'd spend most of that time behind bars, Albert," interjected I. "Yes, you're right. Perhaps that would be the case, William. Shauna was her own person, and showed a distinct lack of common sense and conscience on occasion." "On occasion?" asked Megan. "Okay, but too often," Albert agreed. "Be that as it may, young man, it's about time to repair your relationship with your daughter." Albert gave a cursory wave of his hand, and our waitress appeared. He whispered something to her that I couldn't catch, and then she disappeared again. After a few minutes, Albert suddenly rose to his feet and ordered, "Come on, you two. We can't do this in front of the whole world and his wife. It might get indecent." Then the large man headed toward the main lobby. The crowd on the dance floor magically cleared a path in front of him. Megan, still clutching my right hand in an iron grip, led me after him. I think I mentioned before that it felt like the day had been pre-planned. This feeling was reinforced when Albert took me to another, much smaller and almost completely deserted, function room. I found it strange that the young fellow guarding the room, he removed the rope blocking the entrance as we approached, turned out to be the same hotel employee to whom I had dropped a few shillings to gain access to the minstrel's gallery. It was furnished more like a lounge bar than a hall, but without the bar itself. But there were many large sofas, and on one of them, nestled in a corner, sat 3 people, 2 men and a woman. For some reason they looked out of place, and I realized that they were not part of the wedding party. For one thing, they didn't have white carnations on them, and even I managed to steal one before the service started. The woman. At first glance, I mistook her for one of the hotel office staff. She looked like a very efficient and damn attractive young receptionist. The 2 guys were a different breed altogether. They were well-dressed, but no frills. And one of them seemed disturbingly familiar. I thought I'd seen him before and maybe even talked to him, but I couldn't remember where or when. The second guy was a complete stranger to me, as was the young woman. Ignoring the 3 uninvited guests, Albert made his way to a circular group of couches. No sooner had he positioned himself and indicated where Megan and I should sit than our waitress appeared with a tray filled with more alcoholic beverages. Uncle Albert. Don't ask me why I chose to address him as Uncle Albert. He's not my uncle, but in this case it was the right thing to do. If you don't loosen up your drink a little, I'll be drunk as a skunk for the rest of the evening. William, drunks fall into a few basic categories: the offensive arguer or brawler, the tedious, talkative drunk, the drowsy drunk, and the nicer, happier drunk. I am aware that you are usually placed in the latter category. Albert replied in an authoritative tone and with a disconcerting smile on his face. I had to admit that Albert correctly described my behavior when I was under the influence of excess alcohol. I no longer drink to excess ever. My wife wouldn't appreciate it if I did, but I was keenly interested in how he could have known this fact. It's not like we revolved in similar circles or anything. Heck, I'd encountered this man no more than 4 or 5 times in my entire life. You seem to know a lot about me, sir. Of course, young man. After what happened, I feel obligated to keep an eye on you. If I could do nothing else, I could see to it that you don't get into any more trouble. I don't understand, sir. Enough of formalities, William. I'm on your side. I've always been on your side. Didn't Megan assure you of that? I must have nodded or something because he continued. Capital. Bear with me a little longer, young man, and all will become clear to you. I hope so. I also hope that you will understand my situation and be able to find it in your heart to forgive me for not taking action sooner. There, you've totally confused me. Bertie. My answer brought a smile to the old man's face, but it didn't stay there long. His gaze moved to the far end of the room. Following his gaze, I saw Witch and George enter the living room. They were quickly followed by Tamsin and her husband. All 4 of them were invited to sit on the neighboring couches across from us. Albert's gaze returned to the entrance to the living room. It was obvious that he expected someone else to join us. What is the meaning of all this, Bertie? Why have you called us here? We've got company, demanded the witch. Please be quiet, Hyacinth. Without your intervention, I'm sure none of this would have been necessary. Shauna was a frivolous girl who made an honest mistake that she was willing to admit until you talked her out of it. I don't know what you're talking about. The witch started to rant, but her husband silenced her. Shut up, Hyacintha. Bertie is quite right, snapped George. Oh my God, worms, I thought to myself. This was something I never dreamed of. At that moment, a man in a black suit and dog collar entered the living room. I recognized him immediately as another prominent member of the Stone clan. A Roman Catholic priest named Father Connor, clearly of Irish descent. However, I was never able to find out his place in the Stone family tree. As far as I knew, all the other members of the Stone clan were strictly Catholic. Anyway, this man has always been pleasant to me on the few occasions we have met. I should add that, whether or not Father Connor held a different faith, he held the same patriarchal position in the family clan as Sir Albert Stone. However, while the crowd gathered in the main hall, I saw Father Connor a couple times, diligently making his way around all the family members. Albert rose to his feet to greet Far. Connor, and then the priest turned to me and shook my hand. I jumped to my feet as soon as Albert rose to his feet. I'm glad you decided to attend today, William. You did a fine job with your speech, young man. Your daughter was certainly surprised to learn that you are so well versed in her life story. Father Connor cast a quick glance at Tamsin as he spoke. My daughter looked a little embarrassed. Thank you, Father. I hope you're doing well. As God intended, William. Now, Megan, have you been avoiding me today? The good father turned his attention elsewhere. I waited patiently for him to finish with Megan, and then we all sat down at the table again. Uncle Albert cleared his throat noisily, in effect saying, now let's get down to business. But it was Father Connor who spoke first. Bertie, you do realize that confessions are supposed to be confidential, right? Totally, Joe, Albert replied. Until recently, my actions have been equally limited. However, it seems to me that I might be able to think of a way out of our general predicament. Very well, as long as everyone understands that I cannot divulge anything that has been told to me in confidence, Father Connor repeated. Albert gave Tamsin a friendly look. Tamsin, would you deny me a favor? I want you to imagine that we are in a courtroom and that you are testifying. You are under oath, if you understand me. Yes, Uncle Bertie, but I don't, began Tamsin to answer. I don't expect you to understand, Tamsin. Not yet. I hope it will become clear to you soon. If not, all this pantomime will prove to be a waste of time. I just want you to answer my questions as fully and honestly as you can under the circumstances. Anything I ask you to say will be hearsay anyway, so it will have no legal effect in a court of law. So are you kidding me? Of course, Uncle Bertie. Now I want you to tell us everything you know about the breakup of your parents' marriage. Wait, Bertie, I tried to interject. Be quiet, Billy, this is my playpen, admonished Albert to me. To be honest, I was quite taken aback by this rebuke. Not so much because of Albert's sharp remark. Rather, it was the fact that he addressed me as Billy. Now, Tamsin, if you would be so kind, continued Albert. Albert, she was only a little girl then. You demand too much of Tamsin, exclaimed the witch. You know, you're probably right, Hyacintha. Albert agreed. Why don't you tell us the story? As I recall, you went there and were old enough to know what was going on. I'm sure you've repeated the story often enough over the years to know it by heart. I don't think I can, replied the witch. For the first time ever, I saw that she was unsure of herself and even looked embarrassed. Oh, but I'm sure you can, Hyacintha. Your diatribe against William here has been your part of the party for years. The obvious. Albert's attack on her grandmother stirred something in Tamsin. She straightened suddenly. I'll do it, started to say Tamsin, but Albert stopped her. Albert seemed to be adamant that the story be told by the witch. I don't understand why, but I have to assume that Albert's initial request that Tamsin tell the story was some sort of legal trick designed to accomplish I don't know what. How legal minds work is often a mystery to us mere mortals. Eventually, the witch relented, though she averted her eyes from my gaze the entire time she spoke. I'm not going to repeat Hyacinth's words here. Some of what she told was completely out of chronological order, and even more of it had nothing to do with the actual events of the time, mother and daughter. Nevertheless, I will try to recount the main points of the story as the witch told it that day. Witch's diatribe. Shauna and William had already been in America for a few months working on a movie. It was Shauna's first feature film, and William was working as an assistant cameraman or something like that. Larry Parker, the director of the movie, was very impressed with Shauna's acting ability and told me that she was about to become a big star. We thought it was going so well. When she called home, Shauna was very excited about getting her big chance to be in the movie. Having 18-month-old Tamsin with her made things a little more difficult, though. Shauna told us that several of the girls on the set were very responsive and looked after Tamsin when she was on set. But one night, everything changed. We got a call that William had gone out and gotten drunk out of his mind. He had gone back to the cabin he and Shauna shared, where she was rehearsing her lines for the next day's filming with Larry's help. For some inexplicable reason, William became enraged and attacked Shauna and poor Larry with a broken chair leg. Luckily, Larry managed to overpower William by knocking him out before he could kill them both. From what I understand, William was completely out of it. However, Larry was unable to prevent William from breaking Shauna's cheekbone. Poor Larry had a hard time too because William gave him a very nasty black eye. The police, of course, brought an assault case against William, but I brought Tamsin back to my place in the UK before the case went to court. I know he was sent to prison, but I have no idea for how long. And of course, he was deported back to the UK after serving his sentence. After William beat her, Shauna divorced William. What else was a poor child to do? No woman should have to endure such treatment from her husband. Shauna was supposed to get another, much larger role in a movie that was to be filmed in Hollywood. Larry had arranged it. But her face never healed before filming began, and she lost that opportunity. William's rampage that night robbed Shauna of the chance to be the successful actress she was supposed to be. The poor girl was so terrified of what William would do when he returned to the country that we were forced to get a court order forbidding him to go near her. As we all know, there have been several legal battles over the years, but from that day to this day, we have not seen William outside of a courtroom. The witch, looking quite pleased with herself, leaned back on the back of the couch, effectively announcing that the story was over. But I noticed that she still wouldn't look me in the eye. I was convinced that she couldn't do that, because she was well aware that the story she had just told was neither a complete nor an accurate picture of the events in the States that weekend. I didn't sit silently and listen to the Witcher's dialogue as Albert wanted me to. Several times I had to object, add, or correct details that the Witcher either ignored or didn't know about. However, Megan, still clinging tightly to my right hand, seemed to sense every time I was beginning to lose my patience. She squeezed my hand, and almost at the same instant, apparently they were communicating somehow, her Uncle Albert signaled me to be quiet. "You seem to be a very rowdy drunk, William," remarked Albert. "I find that very hard to believe. And it's also rather strange that you managed to keep out of jail already. It must have been 22 years? I nodded, confirming Albert's assessment. "It's rather odd that I haven't gotten any reports of you losing control of your emotions while under the influence. For the information of those of you not in the know, William has been watched for years by certain aides. And for some time, William has been, well, let's face it, a little violent. Be that as it may, I have a feeling that William's interpretation of events will have a slightly different connotation. Why don't you enlighten us as to your take on that ill-fated weekend, William?" I unhooked Megan from my arm and shifted a little in the seat. I didn't want her to interrupt me or disturb my thoughts. In fact, I suddenly felt naked without the comforting feeling of Megan beside me. Then I looked directly at Tamsin because she was the one I needed to understand. "What your grandmother said was wrong from the beginning. A friend asked me to be the second unit cameraman on that movie. It was supposed to be an action movie set in a mountainous area. The second unit had to shoot all the long shots, often with understudies instead of the main actors. That's always been my strong point, long shots and working with the phone. They only paid for Shauna to fly to the States because I refused to fly without her. I thought of it as a nice free vacation for Shauna. The crew rented a winter vacation complex of sorts. They probably got it on the cheap because it was filmed outside of the regular season. I didn't think for a minute that they would ask Sean to replace an actor who broke his leg on the first day of filming. True, they had to do a little creative work to turn a small role into a female character. Shauna did a couple TV commercials, so she was in the right place at the right time. It was cheaper to use her than to find her, and then fly her on an airplane with another actor. Oh, they cut her skiing scene. One bitten, two shy, if you know what I mean. I was completely unaware of what was going on behind my back, even though I knew that Larry Parker had to be banging some naive young female on the crew. That is Larry's way. Inside the industry, he was infamous for his philandering ways. Besides, I thought Parker was my friend, and I made the mistake of thinking that friends don't seduce other friends' wives. We finished shooting on location that Friday. Everything else was supposed to be filmed at the studio. Shauna's character was not required for any of that filming. It was a very small role. Anyway, on Friday afternoon, me and the rest of my team had to pack all of our gear to have it ready to return to the rental company. All technical gear is hired as needed. In any case, the packing went better than planned, and we got everything packed up much sooner than I expected. I got back to the cabin that Shauna and I shared around 5:30. I didn't think I'd be back there before 10 in the evening. But when I got there, it was empty. No loving wife, no sleeping child. All I found was a note. This note. I pulled out my wallet and handed Tamsin the tattered piece of paper. Albert, however, took it from my hands. He slowly and very carefully unfolded the rest of the document. Then he read aloud the words scrawled on it. "Billy, I'm going away with Larry. He loves me and is going to make me a big star in Hollywood. Please don't follow us and don't make a fuss. Shauna." Short and to the point. Albert commented, "Go on, William, but I think we all understand where this is going." "Shooting on location is over, you say?" "Yes, sir, it was," replied I. "Then it turns out Shauna's practicing lines for the story for the next day, doesn't it?" "But carry on anyway, kid. Let's get to the fun part." "You have only his word for it," the witch bellowed. "How do you know he's not lying?" "Very true, Hyacinth," Albert agreed. "Let's see if we can verify a few facts." Albert looked towards the three strangers. "Reginald, if you would be so kind." A man who didn't look familiar to me stood up and walked toward us, carrying a briefcase. "Sir?" he addressed Albert as soon as he came within a comfortable distance. "Do you have copies of the script for this movie?" Reginald didn't answer anything. He pulled a folder out of his briefcase and held it out to Albert. Albert didn't even bother to open the folder, just tossed it on the coffee table with the couches around it. If anyone wishes to dispute Willem's account, they will find that it is corroborated by the contents of this file. Now go on, William, please. I was confused for a few seconds, interrupting my train of thought. I had to literally calm my emotions before I could continue. When I found that note, I was horrified and apoplectic. Yes, and I took a couple of drinks to calm my nerves. But then I realized that I wasn't supposed to return to camp until the evening. What's more, I remembered seeing Larry's rental car parked outside his cabin when we got back to camp. Then it occurred to me that Shauna and Larry might have miscalculated. They thought they'd be long gone before I found that note. I have no idea what the prudent thing to do in those circumstances was. All I know is that I wanted at least an explanation from Shauna as to what kind of game she was playing. Parker, I was sure, would dump Shauna as soon as another stupid slut caught his eye. I really couldn't believe that Shauna had forgotten everything I had told her about how the man operated. I wasn't stupid enough to introduce my wife to Parker without preparing her beforehand. And when that nasty type turned on the charm, even the blood-sucking birds in the trees flew to him. Anyway, I found them in the kitchen at Larry's cabin. Parker didn't interest me. I could have dealt with him at any time. He couldn't hide from me for long and stay in the industry, if you know what I mean. I wanted Shauna to explain why she didn't take my warning seriously. However, Larry Parker misjudged my intentions. Perhaps he had been pursued by other spouses in the past. In any case, frankly, he came at me like the proverbial bull at a china shop. I just ducked to the side, and Parker whizzed past me and crashed into the back door, shattering the glass in the process. For a moment, I thought Parker was trying to run. It was later argued in court that I broke the glass by sneaking into the cab. The fact that the broken shards were on the floor outside, and that I had no cuts on my arm and Larry did, was apparently ignored. Of course, it didn't help that I couldn't remember much about the day I first regained consciousness, and didn't for several years. But now I can remember everything in great detail. I don't know how one can describe Larry Parker's fighting technique because it doesn't fit into any of the categories I know of. Anyway, as soon as he recovered from his collision with the door, he lunged at me again. I ducked again, but managed to hit him once as he passed me. I figured it would cool his ardor a bit or something. Big mistake, my punch changed the direction of his rampage. Parker ran into Shauna and they collapsed to the floor. Shauna was still, to my surprise, sitting on the chair next to the bar. I guess it was the same chair that didn't survive the collision. I actually thought Parker was out of the game and Shauna didn't look too smart. So I pulled Parker off of her and helped Shauna to her feet. I remember Shauna looking me in the eye, apparently she was very stunned. And then the damn lights went out! When I awoke 4 days later, I found myself confined to a hospital bed. I remembered nothing of the day in question, nor of the few days that had preceded it. Memories that were to return, I would add, very slowly, over the following months and years. Anyway, Tamsin, these are my memories of that fateful day. Everything that has happened since then has been completely out of my control. I have no idea who or what hit me. And I have come to the conclusion that it was Larry Parker's head that broke your mother's cheekbone when he crashed into her. I'm guessing it was him who cracked me over the head, fracturing my skull, with the leg from that broken chair Shauna was sitting on. Why those two decided to accuse me of fighting, I have no idea. And since your mother, with the help of her lawyers, made sure I didn't get close enough to ask her. I learned that Larry Parker was found dead, from bullet wounds, in a motel room in Los Angeles while I was still enjoying the hospitality of the American legal system, so I couldn't ask him about it. I strongly suspect that Parker decided to sleep with the wrong spouse. Larry Parker seems to have discovered that some Yankees can be extremely possessive and quite vindictive. Plus, they can be very energetic in their handling of firearms. I leaned back on the back of the couch, unable to add anything more, lest I seem too vindictive toward my daughter's mother. Megan clutched at my right hand again and kissed my cheek in surprise. Tamsin sat silently staring at me. It was like she was trying to look right into my brain. Suddenly, she shifted her gaze to Albert. You know what really happened, don't you, Uncle Albert? Mother told you, didn't she? Then Tamsin instantly shifted her penetrating gaze to Father Connor. She told you too! She did so, my child, but like your Uncle Albert's, our hands were tied, Father Connor replied. We cannot divulge what has been told to us in the strictest secrecy. In my case, it is a confession. In Albert's case, attorney's privilege, added Tasman's new husband. That's when I first realized the guy spoke American. His mother and father were definitely not American. In the British legal system, we use a different term for it, young man. But essentially, it boils down to the same restriction of action, Albert assured him. Tamsin, I'm sure your mother wouldn't lie to you, the witch ventured. Tamsin jumped to her feet and gave her grandmother a hostile look. She shifted so that she could look her grandmother directly in the eye. Me too, grandmother. But my mother never actually explained to me what happened back then. What I know, I learned elsewhere. Whenever I asked my mother about it, she always changed the subject or went off in another direction. Suddenly, Tamsin spun on her heels and walked across the room to where the three strangers were sitting and turned to the man who seemed familiar. I recognize you, don't I? She demanded. Yes, young lady, perhaps it is, replied the man. Uncle Albert hinted that someone was looking out for me, and I can remember seeing you more than once at my school. I'm also sure I saw you a few times in Bristol when I was at university. It's possible, miss, the man agreed. So, given the fact that my uncle has hinted that my father is also being watched by someone, and I know that Reginald and Shirley work in my Uncle Albert's London office, I suspect that it is you who has been watching my father as much as I have. Am I right? As it should be, yes, miss, you're right, replied the man. So what are you, a private investigator? I'm a retired police officer, miss. The one your uncle turns to when he requires my specialized services. Tamsin turned, looked me straight in the eye and grinned. Then she turned back to the man. I assume you have studied the events of that evening very carefully, ever in the past? The man confirmed with a nod of his head that this was the case. Then please tell me, do you believe my father is an honest man? Has he not deceived us today? Not to my knowledge, miss, replied the man. Thank you, officer. I'm sorry you didn't give your name. Sergeant White is retired, miss. Chalky for my friends. Thank you, Petty. Why Uncle Bertie didn't send you just to tell me the truth, I don't understand. I only do what I'm asked to do, miss. And could you shed some light on why my Uncle Albert had to keep quiet for so long, Mel? I can only speculate, miss. But I believe your uncle was defending some unnamed person against a charge of perjury. But why would she want to perjure herself in the first place? That I can't tell you, miss. However, I might point out that a movie producer cannot promote a young actress if he himself is sitting in a jail cell with a felony conviction for grievous bodily harm. Or whatever they call it in America. Suddenly it all made sense, exclaimed Tamsin. How long have you known your father? She asked, turning to look at me. No, Tamsin, but that's what I assumed, I replied. I don't know how seriously your mother was hurt that night, but I wasn't sure from the beginning that she remembered the events as clearly as she claimed in court. Shauna may have repeated to the police the story Parker fed her. Tamsin turned to Petty again. May I invite you and your assistants to be my husband and guests of honor for the rest of the evening? She asked. All three of them thanked Tamsin, after which she literally pushed them out into the main function room. Then she walked slowly back across the room to us, looking me straight in the eye the whole time. Tamsin, the witch began, stepping closer. Please don't talk to me now, Grandma. I'm too angry, and I might say something I'll regret. Grandfather, be good enough to see your wife off and attend to the guests. Paul and I will be out soon. Without a word, George lifted the witch to her feet and guided her down the road. Tamsin walked over and hugged Father Connor and then Uncle Albert. She did not speak to them, but just hugged them. Then she turned to Megan and to me. May I take your mind off my father for a moment, Aunt Megan? I'd like to talk to him alone. Then she turned to her husband. Paul, Aunt Megan likes to dance. The guy understood, and so did Megan. When they went out into the main hall, Tamsin and I, Tamsin ran me the way Megan had all day, headed out into the hotel gardens. For a very long time, Tamsin didn't speak, just held tightly to my left hand. But finally she asked, How can I begin to apologize to you, Father? Slightly confused, I asked, "Why, baby?" She stopped, and I turned around to face her. "Well, I guess the way I spoke to you earlier. But I feel like I have something to apologize to you for. If I could just figure out exactly what for, I'd feel a lot happier." "The truth is, kid, you're the one who should be apologizing. You and I are the victims. All we have to do now is make up for lost time," I replied. "You don't look very angry, Father." "I've had many years to realize that anger doesn't make things better, Tamsin. What it can do, though, is get you in very deep trouble. Believe me, I've been through this before." "But Grandma..." "Your grandmother never loved me, Tamsin, ever since your mom and I started courting." "But why? What did you do that upset her?" "I was born on the side your grandmother considers wrong, Tamsin. And I courted her daughter. Snobbery, plain and simple. Will I like my father looking over my shoulder?" "I hope so, kiddo. But I won't be able to be around all the time. Remember, most of my work involves Antarctica. I'm there most of the year. Somehow I don't think my Aunt Megan is going to like this. She seems to have a bit of a crush on you." "What happened to her husband? I think she got married," I asked. "Okay, that's not true. Megan hinted that she was married. I just wanted to get a little history without asking her." Tamsin chuckled. "Oh yes, that's right. He was a handsome fellow too, but a little too skilled with his fists." "What do you mean?" "They were arguing about something and he hit Megan." "God, what has she done?" "Dad, do you remember Aunt Megan telling you how she was bullied at school?" "Yeah, that's right. I took her to the gym and taught her how to defend herself." "Megan's ex-husband felt the effects of your instructions. He was taken away in an ambulance." "Shit, did Megan get hurt?" "With Uncle Bertie on the case. Her ex got 2 years probation." "Well, that's good to know. I'd hate to be the cause of strife in Megan's life. She was a good kid." "Do you like my Aunt Megan, Father? I can see she's partial to you." "I always liked Megan, Tamsin. But she was your mother's younger sister, who was my fiancée and then my wife. Remember, younger sister. You have to control your emotions under those circumstances." "Said it all very Uncle Bertie-like, Father, hell, Dad." "So I said it, and it wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. From now on, you're my daddy, okay?" "I don't mind, kid." Tamsin wrapped her arms around my neck, pulled me to her, and kissed my cheek. "I'll enjoy hearing my nickname Kiddo every time you say it, Daddy. But as I was saying, or rather tried to say, my mom is dead, my dad and Aunt Megan. Well, I always liked my Aunt Megan." "May I assume a sort of seal of approval, Tamsin?" I asked. "You bet, Dad, you'll go after her." "Don't jump to conclusions, Tamsin. Megan is recalling her older brother's character, not her lover. The two are not necessarily interchangeable." "Uncle Bertie has spoken again. Let's go back to the house. I want to brag about Daddy to all my friends." "What about your new husband?" "Paul left me to myself on a cruise ship for 2 weeks. He has nothing to complain about." We returned to the house and I was introduced to what seemed like hundreds of young people. I didn't notice Megan, who I hoped would save me, but eventually Bertie appeared beside me. Tamsin seemed a little reluctant, but finally agreed that I could go out for a walk with Bertie. In fact, from what I gather, Bertie needed a cover when he slipped outside for a cigar. Apparently, Bertie's very quiet wife does not approve of his smoking. We went out to the patio and Bertie lit a cigar. "You do realize that I would never make Shauna sit through this, don't you, William?" he said. "Bertie, I may be silly, but I'm not stupid. She really was something special, wasn't she?" "Yes, she was, and she was terribly afraid of going to prison, especially an American prison." "I wonder, would have sent her to prison for perjury? She must have hit her head pretty hard to break her cheekbone like that. In an English court, I have my doubts. But in an American court, I have no idea." Hyacinth frightened Shauna that she would be sent to prison anyway. "And Shauna witnessed your railroad trial. I read the transcript, William. It was small-town justice that left a lot to be desired. A decent appeal wouldn't hurt you. Bertie, by the time I'd sorted it out, I should have been released anyway. An appeal filed then would have gotten Shauna to go in the opposite direction, especially since Larry Parker was dead. You know better than anyone how, some legal moguls look at things when they find out they've been cheated. Some bastard's gotta pay. You're a sentimental fool, William. Hark, who speaks? Replied I. Albert took one last puff of his cigar and crushed it against the balustrade. Don't mention this to Memsahib William, or I'll be castrated. Now we'd better get back inside before Megan goes on another rampage. That girl has a thing for you, young man. I've noticed, Bertie, I've noticed. Capital, capital, he replied as we returned to the function room. It wasn't until Tamsin and Paul disappeared into the hotel honeymoon suite that I realized I didn't have a reservation for that evening. My original plan had been to return to the rented cottage on the south coast that I had called home. Don't worry, I have a spare bed in my room. You can use it. Megan, aren't you rushing things a little too fast? You know you have to rush things. Hey, watch it, stud. I've seen you in action and I want it to be the same this time? What do you mean you've seen me in action? You said it yourself, Billy. I'm particularly good at sneaking around, and I've sneaked up on some people more than once and watched them. Your little hideout in the woods turned out not to be as big a secret as you and Shauna thought. Damn it, you're a pervert, Megan! You want to see perversion? I'll show you perversion. Let's go to my room! I woke up to the feeling of an unfamiliar heaviness on my chest. When I opened my eyes and looked at my chest, I saw Megan's face, who was smiling back at me. Already recovered? She asked. Damn girl, you don't do things by halves, do you? I only had one night I could be sure of, Billy. I had to make sure you understood what you were offering, on a regular basis. Is that some kind of offer, Megan? I asked. Of course, love, and I can get Father Connor here in no time to make it official, if you'll let me. Father Connor is a Roman Catholic, Megan, and we're both from the Church of England, aren't we? Details, 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 I thought you were a sailor, Billy? Yes, but what does that have to do with the price of apples? Any port in a storm, lover? I'd marry a bleeding rabbi if you asked me to. Besides, I've got this one! Megan held out the envelope for me to see. And please tell me what is in that envelope, Megan? 2 cruise tickets, an equally luxurious suite paid for by my old uncle, and it just so happens to be the same cruise where a certain man's daughter and her new husband will be spending their honeymoon. Okay, you can meet your daughter during the day and we can have sex every night. Megan, when did you and good old Bertie start planning these Shanghai exercise, or whatever you call it? To be completely honest with you, Billy, the basic plan Bertie came up with after Shauna's funeral. Of course, my Uncle Bertie didn't envisage me seducing you. It was entirely my idea and fell under the heading of preferred outcome. So, what do you think of this cruise? I looked down again and saw the wistful expression on Megan's face. I think I shall enjoy my vacation, my dear. However, we won't have time to get a marriage license before the ship sails. Don't worry, Billy, I checked. It's registered in Bermuda. What does that mean, Fact? You'll find out soon enough, hubby, you'll find out. Now, how do you fancy another walk on the deck before breakfast? She grinned. I grinned back at Megan. We only had time for breakfast that morning. Life goes on. C'est la vie épilogue. Megan and I didn't get married on the ship. Although she and I were fine with it, Bertie's wife didn't want to do it. For such an outwardly modest old lady, Beatrice could be very bossy when she wanted to be. Not surprising, considering who exactly she had been married to since time immemorial. Beatrice organized our marriage. I'm sure it was all paid for by Bertie himself. Of course, it wasn't as lavish as Tamsin's, but neither Megan nor I wanted it to be. Frankly, we'd both prefer a private affair aboard ship with Tamsin and Paul as witnesses. The witch didn't attend our wedding, but Megan's father gave her away in marriage. He even said, "This is getting to be a habit, William," as he handed me his daughter's hand. Bertie went through the whole day with a huge grin on his face. During his speech, he even claimed that he was responsible for bringing the bride and groom together. Which I suppose he was, pretty much. Although I believe Megan's determination would have eventually brought us together some other way if I hadn't snuck into Tamsin's wedding. My wife, when she knows what she wants, seems able to move mountains to get it. She can certainly bend Uncle Bertie to her will, and that's not so hard. Her only problem is that Megan spends a lot of time thinking. Like, are we getting up now? Or do we just hang out on the deck a little longer first? This, I assure you, is wreaking havoc on my work schedule. And it's not too good for my back. I'm not as young as I used to be. And it doesn't matter if my wife wants to believe otherwise. Yes, but I don't work in the South Seas anymore. Bertie knew someone who was acquainted with someone whose brother is a commissioned producer, or something like that, in the BBC Wildlife Department. I unexpectedly found Megan's phone hyped up with offers for wildlife shoots. Mostly in the UK and all moderately lucrative. All in all, just right for me. Megan and I have decided that having kids is not an issue. We feel like with the Tamsin twins, we'll have our plate full of worries. That's assuming she and Paul don't play soccer. We settled into a quaint little bungalow around the corner from Paul and Tamsin's house. A convenient distance for pushing a stroller. And Bertie pushed Paul and I to the local golf club. Our Sunday mornings with the four of us became a regular occurrence. The fourth contestant? George, of course. Now that he and the witch are no longer husband and wife, he has been elevated or restored to the position of second grandfather in my daughter's eyes. Bertie, of course, takes precedence. Well, since he's the patriarch of the family, what did you expect? Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch for the next video.